Hello, everyone. All right. So, sorry I'm about a minute late. Um, Had some trouble logging on to See Learn this morning. But anyway, here we are. I think we left off somewhere around this slide, talking about um, various definitions like events, agency, an agent, volition, things like that. In the interest of moving things along as quickly as possible, we'll just give a brief recap of the idea of determinism, and then we'll move on, since we do have quite a lot to cover. So, one of the things that we were talking about last time with respect to determinism is how human beings, um, are not exceptions to, um, I don't know, natural laws, right? So, this includes Uh, this includes the physical, but also the mental. Not to come off sounding like a dualist or anything, but if the mental um, uh, depends on the physical, as a lot of theories have it, um, then my decisions to do certain things are going to be, or it looks like, they are going to be determined by antecedent conditions, that is prior conditions, and physical laws. So if you strike my knee with a patellar hammer, sure, the knee will move. There will be a reflex response, and that is caused by something outside of myself, the doctor striking my knee with a hammer. So, sure, that's determined in a sense, in that it's not caused by me, but by forces acting upon me. But the mental is like that too. So even if you say, well, um, if I decide to move my knee and then I am the author of that act, then I'm free because I caused that event, the moving of my knee. Um, but a determinist might reply that, well, were you really free? Probably not, because your mind, being contingent upon something physical like the brain, is still subject to those physical laws. And depending on what the antecedent conditions were, the action that follows is determined. It'll be this or that action based upon the laws of nature and some set of particular prior conditions, right? That's what hard determinism is saying. Um, and Laplace puts this very well, right? Pierre Simon de Laplace was a late 18th, early 19th century astronomer, and he described a situation where kind of, sort of, maybe a little similar to that of Descartes' evil genius, where we have a supremely knowledgeable intellect who knows all of the laws of nature, all of the antecedent conditions. Such a being would know exactly what would happen, how things would play out in the future. This is the way he put it. He said, we may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect, which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion and all positions of all items of which nature is composed, if this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. So we call this Laplace's demon. So it has godlike knowledge, you could say. And it's a very good illustration, on the one hand, of hard determinism. This being who knows all of the prior conditions, all of the laws of nature, basically could work like a giant predictive computer. Um, and it would know what all of those uh, things from the biggest celestial bodies like stars and black holes and stuff, right down to atoms. It would know how those things are going to behave. And you and me and everyone else is, of course, made of atoms. So this demon would have foreknowledge of, I don't know, say like it knew everything that was going on today with me and with the entire universe. It would know with exact certainty, Laplace is saying, what I will do tomorrow, what I will do 10 years from now. Just like it knows where the Earth will be when it comes to its position, as it orbits the sun. So that's Laplace's demon. And another interesting thing, it has its knowledge you could maybe describe as godlike, right? It's omniscient. It knows everything. And that raises another question. Laplace was an atheist. So famously, when he published some book on astronomy, Napoleon, of all people, Napoleon Bonaparte, read it and asked Laplace, "Oh, where's God? I don't see God in your book. On you're talking about celestial bodies and how they move and everything like that, Laplace, but there's no mention of God in your book." And Laplace famously replied, "I had no need of that hypothesis, sir." Um, so he's an atheist, but if you believe in God, and you probably believe that God is omniscient, God is all-knowing. So God is in a position quite like Laplace's demon. So if there's a God who is omniscient, and we'll consider this next week when we talk about arguments for God's existence, then does the fact that God knows all, that must include knowing how things will go, how things will play out. So does that imply that we do not have free will? Some people would say it does. Others would say no, God allows for free will. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. In any case, you can see that there's not a whole lot of room for free will. No room at all, indeed, um, on hard determinism, right? And remember from last time, the definition of freedom that we're working with is the ability to do otherwise or have done otherwise, right? This morning I got up. I think I decided to make coffee. Could I have done otherwise? Could I have made something else? Maybe some tea? Could I have skipped the coffee altogether? Well, the more I think about it, the more I don't think I could. Or maybe I don't think I could will myself to skip the coffee, right? So the reason why I could not have done otherwise is because everything is determined by natural laws and antecedent conditions. And so that implies, again, as we discussed last time, that there's no room for moral responsibility. If determinism is true, I cannot be held responsible for anything, good or bad. So these are the hard determinists, as William James termed them, or incompatibilists, if you like, because they believe that free will is incompatible with a deterministic universe. And there are other arguments for determinism as well, like Peter van Inwagen's. I'm probably mispronouncing that name, but he has an argument called the consequence argument for determinism. Obviously, we can't change the past. Those are fixed events. But what happens now is not fixed, at least not fixed like the past is. And yet, what happens now going forward is determined by the past, which is fixed. It's determined by the past and those pesky laws of nature we're talking about. So determinism is true, and we don't have freedom of the will. But again, just because we live in a deterministic universe does not mean that uh, we are not free. We may still be free in some important sense, and that is the important sense we've been talking about, the sense in which we could do otherwise. Okay. Um, One thing you want to watch out for when you're talking about freedom of the will is not mixing it up with fatalism. Fatalism says that events that happen are metaphysically necessary, right? Determinism implies physical necessity, like if the cue stick strikes the cue ball, it will roll a certain way and strike the eight ball, which will then roll into the corner pocket, or it won't, depending on where all of the billiard balls are, etc. Right? But it's physical causation. A affects B in some way where B has to occur if A occurs, right? But that's not metaphysical necessity, which is kind of like, bigger. Um, Fatalism, I think a lot of people, if you were to just try to describe fatalism, it would be a position where one adopts fate or destiny, right? Something that has metaphysical or cosmic significance. So, fatalism also, if you're a fatalist, it implies that you ought to just accept the way things are going because you can't change them, right? I personally see it related somewhat to what psychologists call magical thinking. So, and I'm certainly not trying to be facetious with this example, but I have known people that are fond of the adage that everything happens for a reason. And I used to get into discussions with these folks, right? That I think quite clearly uh, carve out the difference between being a fatalist and a determinist, right? If you say everything happens for a reason, you mean like a metaphysical reason, right? Like God or the universe or some force ordained something to happen. Um, how I would respond to these people when I would speak with them, I would say, well, everything has a cause. Everything happens for a reason, and that reason is a cause, like a physical cause. Sure, that's determinism. But the idea that everything happens for some kind of grander purpose is fatalism. And more so, the idea that you can't change it. So the example, if I'm remembering correctly, the example that Crumley uses is Oedipus the King from Sophocles' famous play, right? Oedipus is well, his parents receive an oracle that says, um, "Okay, you're going to have a son, and he's going to kill the father and marry the mother." Okay, and so Oedipus's parents think, "Uh-oh, well, we can't have that." So they kind of put him out in nature. They abandon him, they expose him. But Oedipus grows up and um, he inadvertently, he doesn't know he kills his father, but he kills his father. I believe it's at Crossroads or something where they encounter one another, and he kills the father and steals his chariot. Eventually goes back to, I think, Thebes, where uh, he um, falls in love with and marries his mother. And so, with the intention of preventing these foretold events from occurring, they then come to occur, right? Or if you like a science fiction sort of example, there are those science fiction stories where people do something like time travel to prevent something from happening, and in so doing, they actually cause the thing they're trying to prevent. That's kind of like a fatalist sort of thing, too, right? And Richard Taylor has the idea of this imagined example involving a book, The Life of Osmo, which is kind of an eerie example, right? Fatalism is the belief that whatever happens is unavoidable, he writes. That is the clearest expression of the doctrine, and it provides the basis of the attitude of calm acceptance that the fatalist is thought quite correctly to embody. One who endorses the claim of universal causation, then, and the theory of causal determinism of all human behavior, is a kind of fatalist, or at least he should be if he is consistent. So he's saying, like, look, you determinists should just be fatalists. You'll be happier, right? Ah, yes. That's another example, no, I mean, yeah. I saw a couple episodes of that way back in the day. Um, but yeah, she would get a vision, right, of the future. That was the whole idea. You get a vision of the future, and then you try to prevent those events from coming about, and then inevitably you bring them about, right? Yeah. I forget what particular event it was, but I do remember those cuts they would do where uh freeze, look at the camera, vision, right? As an example, to sort of illustrate what Taylor's talking about, he's come up with this idea of a character called Osmo. And Osmo visits the library one day, and he comes across a very curious book entitled The Life of Osmo. And as he reads through this book, he sees that the book describes his entire life perfectly accurately. So he continues reading, and he sees that 3 years from now, the book ends with Osmo dying in a plane crash. He decides, maybe to pull a Raven and not die in the plane crash. But of course, all his efforts to do so resolve with him dying in the plane crash. And Taylor says, "Look, our lives are determined like Osmos, um, and if we just accept that and try and live with it, we'll be happier people." I don't know. Um, I get it to a certain extent. I can see how, if hard determinism is true and I really don't have freedom of the will, then perhaps accepting fatalism would make for a more peaceful life. But in making that choice to accept or to not accept fatalism, am I not exercising my will? I don't know. Something to think about. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's an okay, perfect example of fatalism. Yeah, Final Destination. I'm of that generation where everybody's afraid of logging trucks because of that opening scene, with the logging truck, all the logs on the back. Yeah, and of course I grew up in the sticks up in northern Ontario, so I don't drive now. You might find this is actually kind of funny. I cannot drive in the city. I just can't. I get like sensory overload, but I learned to drive on these old back gravel roads where there would often be logging trucks. And these roads are very nearly single lane. So these logging trucks are barreling down the road, and if you see one coming, you had to listen for them. And if one comes, you have to like scooch way over to the side of the road as far as you can, and they pass you real fast. And it was nerve-wracking, but there was nothing else happening. It was just that was the only other vehicle on the road, so I wasn't so afraid of them. But driving in town for me is like the final destination scene with the lock truck. Couldn't you make small changes? Well, maybe. And that's one idea. Like maybe you're on a course on determinism or fatalism. Maybe you're on a course and you can kind of move around within that course, but you can't get off onto a different course. It might be like that, right? Hmm. Yeah, some would argue that. You know, one of the and that reminds me, one it strikes me just now that one important difference between fatalism and determinism is that on fatalism you might actually still have a choice. It's just that the choice brings about the inevitable future, right? Like, I don't know, one of those time travel movies, right? Um, you want to travel back in time to prevent some disaster. Um, However, in traveling back in time, something about your choosing to do that and the way you affect the present brings about the thing you were trying to prevent. So you're still fated, um, but you still have free will. But it's those choices that bring about uh, fate. So that's an interesting difference between determinism and free will. On determinism, there is no freedom of the will. Your choices are determined. On fatalism, your choices aren't determined, but the outcome of your choices is, right? Um, anyway, maybe dualism can help us. Maybe we could be dualists, right? Right? Dualist? Not a dualist. I don't know if my cat's a dualist or not, but physicalism, remember, says that all physical events are determined. But what if you say that the mind is non-physical? And the mind is the source of the physical stuff that you do with your body, right? You have a non-physical intention to do something which affects the body in such a way that the body brings about what you will it to bring about. So maybe our wills are not determined like this, if substance dualism is true. So if you're a dualist, the mind is non-physical, it's not governed by physical laws. Great, right? Well, not necessarily. Because who's to say there are not mental laws that govern the existence of the mental? So, even if dualism is true, Descartes or some other variation, that doesn't automatically save the notion of freedom of the will. And that's because um, of the possibility of the existence of mental laws, which might determine um, which might determine our wills. So, um, it's a brief sort of consideration of dualism. We won't spend too much time on it, but just know that um, it doesn't necessarily save free will, to say that the mind is non-physical. In fact, the biggest believers in a non-physical mind um, would probably be subscribers to the Abrahamic religions. They're not the only ones. I mean, there are other major religions, Hinduism, for example. A lot of people practice Hinduism, but just because I'm more familiar with these examples, say that you're, like a Christian or something, and you believe that the soul is a sort of non-physical spark of the divine. You also believe in an omniscient God, a God who knows everything. So this is a God that's rather like the demon described by Laplace. So if God knows everything, does that imply I have freedom of the will or do not have freedom of the will? Maybe. And I think that's interesting because here, this is a worldview where you do have um, a non-physical mind or soul that is the author of your actions. Of course, maybe it's possible that you have freedom of the will, God's given you that, but that fatalism is still true. So there is still a sort of grander purpose to things, but you have some choice within that. Yeah, but as we'll discuss next week, all of these divine, we call these divine attributes, and some of them are at odds with others, right? Um, we see this right now. Like, okay, so God knows all, but he gave us free will. So I'm still free, even though God knows everything I'm going to do. Okay, well, then that seems like it's determined whether I'm going to get into heaven or hell or not, right? Or another one is if God is, like you mentioned, if he's all loving, then then why is there evil? Well, maybe there's evil because we have free will. So some of us do evil things. Okay, but since we have free will, now we're back to the whole all-knowing versus free will kind of problem we were at before, right? It's hard to square the divine attributes, is basically what I'm saying. It's hard to square them together. But we'll talk about that more next week. So maybe, I mean, philosophy seems to paint a pretty dim picture of of free will. Whether you're a physicalist or a dualist, we can't really rule it out. But maybe we can look at what science says. And this is this is where I'm going to zero in on one particular thinker that I think is quite interesting. And this is a neuroscientist named Benjamin Liebe. Now, Liebe says almost, or Crumley says almost nothing about this. I'm going to go into further detail because I think it's fascinating. But we've known since about the 1950s that when you make a voluntary action, like, you know, moving your hand, this is preceded by something that we can detect called the readiness potential. We can detect it with an EEG device. You know those EEGs, you put them on your head. It's a bit like a really tight shower cap or a swim cap, but with electrodes. And these electrodes can detect changes in electrical potential on the scalp, which are caused by activity in your brain, by dendritic activity, activity in groups of neurons. Um, so the readiness potential is a slow negative shift in the electrical potential that we detect um, with the EEG. It usually occurs if half a second to 1 second before a voluntary action is performed. So if I decide to flex my wrist or something like this, we detect this activity with a little myoelectric sensor, and we detect the readiness potential here with our EEG. And we can compare, what comes when. Well, on average, about 800 milliseconds, but it can vary from 500 milliseconds to 1 second. Before the action is when you will observe the readiness potential. So Libe wondered, okay, does your conscious urge, your voluntary urge to act, come before the readiness potential or after? If conscious intention is what initiates the action, then your subjective willing of the action should occur before the readiness potential. So he needed to time these events, and that's what he did. So we have our myoelectric sensor on the wrist, detecting the movements of the muscles. We have the readiness potential. Oh my goodness, excuse me, which we can detect by doing many different trials and kind of using statistics to work out the timing of the readiness potential. To measure W, or will, the intention to act, Libe had people monitoring what was basically a clock. It was a little dot going around the screen of an oscilloscope. And the participants in this study had to report where the dot was on the screen. You know, is it at 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock? Where's the dot? Kind of like that. They had to just report where it was when they felt the conscious urge to move. And by timing all of these three events and comparing them against one another, he could work out what came first. We know that the action comes last, but the important question is what comes first? The conscious intention to move or the readiness potential? So if W comes first, the will, and then readiness potential, then action, it seems like our conscious intention causes um, our actions, that we're free, that we're able to author our own actions. But if the readiness potential comes first, followed by W, and then the action, well, then it starts to paint a more deterministic picture. What happened? The readiness potential came first, and then people's conscious intention to move. So the readiness potential happened in this experiment a little over half a second before the action. And the conscious intention to move occurred only 200 milliseconds before the action. So that's kind of unnerving. Now, in some of the trials, the readiness potential happened even further back in time from the action because participants had been thinking about the action in advance. But during the fully spontaneous trials, yeah, it's about little over half a second before the action. And the intention to perform the action occurs quite close to the action, little less than 200 milliseconds on average. That means that your conscious intention to move happens on average 350 milliseconds after the readiness potential. Like an itch, kind of. If the itch precedes the scratch, yeah, the readiness potential precedes the action. But here's the kicker, right? The readiness potential is unconscious. And yeah, it's pretty crazy how Libe was able to work out an experiment to do this. But here's one thing I should say. This does not mean we don't have free will. This just means if we do have free will, it must work differently than we think it does. Libe observed that sometimes there would be the start of a readiness potential and then it would go away. And he asked people, what were you doing on that trial? And the participants would reply, well, I felt the urge to move, but I decided not to. So Libe thought this was evidence for a conscious veto. And this squares quite nicely with other findings from neuroscience. I'll try and explain what I mean once I get the slide going. Here we go. Yeah, Kara, that's a very real possibility, and some replications of this study have found that even the act of monitoring the clock can, for some reason, affect the timing of the readiness potential. So yeah, that's one way you can respond. Maybe the way that the events were timed, or as you say, the way that they're reported, affects what we observe. It's also possible that we're looking at a very limited kind of action, right? And well, it's possible that the neural basis of doing something simple like flicking your wrist or doing this or whatever. I mean, that's a very different kind of deciding than deciding uh, what you'd like to do for your career, right? Um, so maybe Libe's not getting the whole story of human volition, right? Well, yeah, Brady, they're farther away, but nerve signals are very, very fast. Um, if we saw like a difference between these things in terms of 10 or 20 milliseconds, that might be explained by that, but not 200 milliseconds. Not that. The nervous system is not the fastest thing ever, but it's pretty darn fast. Um, but how did Libe save free will? Well, like I said, some of those participants felt the urge to move and then didn't. So Libe thought this is evidence of a conscious veto. And this makes sense. Um, your brain is always kind of trying to predict and analyze the world. One of the things it predicts is things that you can do in the world and with items in the world, right? So, like if my cat shows up here, as he often does, my brain unconsciously forms a motor plan for me to start giving him some pets, right? So here I am doing that. Of course, I can stop if I want. We'll see if he becomes disgruntled when I do so. What do you think? Oh, yep. Now, my brain's always coming up with these motor plans, but I don't carry all of them out because of something called inhibition. My brain inhibits certain motor plans and many other things too. It goes for sensation, perception. My brain inhibits a whole bunch so that it's not constantly overwhelmed, right? But there's a curious neurological condition called environmental dependency syndrome, where you have a problem with inhibition such that you just kind of carry out the random motor plans that your brain is coming up with. And the example I go to is it's in the neuroscience textbook that I used to use when little while ago I used to teach a neuroscience class in the cognitive science department, and I used Bradley Possel's textbook, and he's got a case in there where there was a man with environmental dependency syndrome who was, I guess, visiting his physician at his condo, and he said, "Excuse me, I've got to get up to use the restroom." So he does so. He gets up and leaves the dinner table, goes down the hallway to try and find the restroom. But on his way, he walks past a bedroom, and the door is open to the bedroom. And because of his environmental dependency syndrome, his brain forms a series of motor plans which would cause him to take off his clothes and get into bed and go to sleep. And that's exactly what he did in the middle of dinner. Just, I'll be right back, sees the open door of the bedroom, goes into the bedroom, gets into bed, I guess to get a good night's sleep, just because the bed was there and his brain said, hey, go to bed. And there was no inhibitory process to stop him from doing that. Our brains are like that, but they have the inhibition that is still intact. So I can look at my cat and decide, my brain wants to give him a pet, but I can decide not to. I look at my coffee cup, and my brain forms a motor plan, and I say, yes, brain, let's go ahead and drink that coffee. And that is probably, I think, what Libe is identifying as the conscious veto. And as British psychologist Richard Gregory put it, we might not have free will, but we do have free won't. So your brain is always trying to make you do things, and you are, as an agent, allowing some of them to happen, but not all of them. So just since I'm spending so much time on Libe's work, A lot of people will bring this study up and they'll do two things. Firstly, they'll incorrectly say it was an fMRI study. It wasn't. It was EEG. And they'll say that it proves we don't have free will. No, it doesn't. And the lead researcher on the study, Benjamin Liebe himself, said, well, within this very study, I found evidence for a conscious veto. Your consciousness can allow certain things to happen and disallow others, right? All right. So we're going to get on to the next set of slides, and I'm going to get some coffee. Could I decide not to have coffee? No, I don't. I don't think so. I mean, it's really striking. We were talking about addiction last time. Just, hey, speaking of coffee, remember addiction? No. Um, it is very impressive when someone's able to kick a habit, right? Especially a particularly harmful one. But it really speaks to why, when you're dealing with somebody who perhaps is addicted to, well, a very addictive substance. Um, Something that and this is kind of like a not really the most apt term, but something that's physically addictive. I mean, it's not like things are physically or psychologically addictive, they're just addictive. But what people mean is that some substances cause more psychological withdrawal symptoms and some cause more physical withdrawal symptoms, right? um uh for example, cocaine primarily is psychological withdrawal symptoms. Opiates are physical withdrawal symptoms. Alcohol is both. Probably alcohol is one of the worst substances to try and quit if you're severely addicted to it. So, that really speaks to why we need to have networks of people um, that are helping trying to kick a dangerous habit like that. I'm not giving up the coffee, though. I think it's fine. All right. So, one thing that I think a lot of people wonder about is whether quantum physics can save us from determinism. So, this is a little image of what we detect when we do the double slit experiment, for example. This is, I think, let's see, this is kind of like a waveform interference pattern. So this would be a small segment of an image of a detector where we do not observe uh, the whatever we're shooting through the slits, and we get a different interference pattern. I'll get to this in a moment, but yeah, classical physics, the physics of Isaac Newton gives us a mechanistic picture of the universe, but quantum physics doesn't. Quantum physics, by the way, deals with stuff that's very small. Well, sorry, there are some truck people outside. What are they doing? What is that, a tow truck? I guess someone's getting towed. It is determined. But all right, so classical mechanics, classical physics is like the world we live in. Billiard balls. The cue ball strikes the eight ball, which rolls into the corner pocket. Or indeed the motions of the planets, right? That's all classical physics. Quantum physics deals with very, very small things. The subatomic world. So we're talking about atoms and what the atoms are made of. So something like radioactivity, right? Or fluorescent lights, right? This is the stuff that quantum physics tells us about. And at the quantum level, things are probabilistic. Um, they're kind of random. And this is part of the appeal, perhaps, for people who want to save freedom of the will. But it's also part of a problem that's very hard to contend with. And that is that randomness uh, is no better than being completely determined. You're not free either way. Like if classical physics is describes the way the entire universe works, then it seems like I'm pretty determined and I don't have a choice. I could not have done otherwise. But if quantum mechanics describes how the whole universe works, then, well, I'm not free if everything I do is just random, right? So if everything is ultimately random, then I'm not free in the important sense. Let's get myself out of the way here. Um, maybe weighing up, and this is an argument from Robert Kane, maybe weighing up different decisions um, is the equivalent of contending with different options in quantum indeterminacy. So, um, the outcome we choose is random, sure, but it's not uh, arbitrary. I don't know if that makes me feel any better. Um, arbitrary means that it is chosen. That's what the word means. Arbitrary comes from the Latin, which means like to decide. So it's random, it's not chosen, but it's based on reasons to do with quantum theory. Okay, I'm still not a free agent then. But maybe these choices inform our character, and if you embrace the character formed by these choices, then you're free. I don't know. First of all, I think it's weird to say that different options we can take correspond to different options that subatomic particles might take in quantum indeterminacy. By the way, are we all up to snuff on what that means? I realize I haven't quite explained what quantum indeterminacy means. I mean, you've probably heard about the double slit experiment or Schrodinger's cat. Do those ring any bells? So some of you have heard of them, yeah. Okay, well, Schrodinger's cat, yeah, Chloe's got it. Schrodinger's cat, like, it's a thought experiment by Erwin Schrödinger. He said, like, there are certain things we can't know at the quantum level until we observe. It would be rather like having a cat in a box, and the cat is in there with some poison that's connected to a bit of radioactive material. Now, radioactivity is a quantum mechanical process, so it's random. There's a 50-50 chance of the radioactive material having completely decayed or not decayed when you open the box. But you need to observe it to know. So that's why he says it's like the cat is dead and alive at the same time in the box until we open the box and observe, because the radioactive material, which its decay is what determines whether the poison is released or not. Um, That's a quantum mechanical process that depends in some way on observation. Now, here's the thing. It's not the act of observing that causes one or the other. This is a really big misconception. It is the act of observing, but it's not the conscious observer. This is where people inadvertently get into something called quantum mysticism. It's not my mind observing the cat that determines the outcome. It's just the act of observing affects the quantum mechanical process. And that's what's illustrated by the double slit experiment. We shoot, photons through two slits. Now, when we don't observe, we just let it happen and we come back later. The photons behave like a wave. They seem to go through each slit at the same time. And so we get an interference pattern that looks like a waveform. Um, Now, if we observe, we put some kind of camera or something there, then the photons behave like particles, and they'll go through one slit or the other with a 50-50 probability. And we'll get a different interference pattern. Jonah says it's that when things are so small, we can't observe them without affecting them somehow. Yeah, that's pretty much what I think is going on. Granted, I'm not a physicist. So anything beyond this, you're going to want to ask your physics prof. But the point is that uh, this is quantum indeterminacy. It's really, I mean, it's like as far as I'm concerned, our purposes here, it's an epistemological problem, if you think about it. It's a problem with what we can know. Because when we observe things, we necessarily affect them. And that means we can only know certain things, but not other things when it comes to the behavior of these particles. We can know the spin of a particle, but not its charge. We could know its charge, but not its direction. Why? Because observing the particle affects it and it changes it. So there's only certain things we can know, and that's called quantum indeterminacy. And the double slit experiment, Schrodinger's cat, this is related to the observer effect, the measurement problem. So if you want to know more about that, you should ask your physics professor if you have one. Okay, Cormac says, can we actually prove that they're non-deterministic through like how we know that some quantum processes wasn't always going to result in some outcome? Wouldn't we have to see the future or something like that to be able to know? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Could we prove that quantum mechanical processes are really non-deterministic? I mean, they certainly seem to be, yet we've harnessed quantum phenomena to um our advantage. Um Fluorescent lights. Quantum mechanics sounds so cool and futuristic. Every time you walk into a room with fluorescent lights, that's a quantum mechanical process. So you have a light bulb that contains fluorine gas, and an electric charge is put through the gas, and the electrons orbiting those fluorine atoms jump. It's called a quantum leap. So they don't, and here's what I mean by, like, uh, what, why quantum physics is so weird. The electrons don't move. There's various orbits around the atomic nuclei that they can have. So they don't move like this up to another orbit. They're here and then they're here. It's like they pop out of existence here and boop, now they're in the higher orbit. turn the light off, bloop, down into the lower orbit. They don't move from one orbit down to a lower orbit. They're there and then they're there, right? It's weird. So anyway, we use quantum mechanics all the time for different stuff. Your touchscreen on your phone, relies on the same sort of processes. Um, yeah, it's curious, but will we ever know that it's truly random? I mean, I think physicists kind of do think it's truly random, but there's of course some physicists. This we're getting into like the philosophy of physics here, you know. Um, so don't just ask your physics professor, ask a philosopher of science. Ask them, do they think that these things we're describing, like electrons and photons, are they really real? Or are they merely theoretical tools that help us explain what happens when, I don't know, we turn lights on, right? Like are the scientific categories of all these subatomic things, are these real or are they theoretical and useful and not actually real, right? So we we definitely don't have time to talk about that. Um, So indeterminism, levels of analysis. I'll just speak very briefly about this. In all of the sciences, you've got to keep in mind that there are different levels of analysis that we work at. So physicists work at a very small level of analysis, right? The atomic and the subatomic. Chemists work with the atomic and the molecular. So what happens when we put different combinations of atoms together? Well, we get various chemicals and they behave in certain ways, but their behavior is due to physical properties that are described at that sort of quantum level, right? And then you have biology, which is really like just chemistry for stuff that's alive, right? So at one level, the quantum level, things appear to be random and indeterminate. But at a higher level, like the world we occupy, things appear determined. But maybe at the level of the mental, there are mental properties that emerge from more fundamental properties. We call these emergent properties. I mentioned those last time. Maybe freedom of the will is an emergent property. Now, emergent properties, you can think of them as something like complex properties that arise out of simpler interactions or simpler arrangements of stuff. In his book Mindware, Andy Clark mentions a couple of really interesting examples. One is convection currents in your frying pan. You ever be cooking dinner and you've got your frying pan heated up and you put some cooking oil in? I've got a big old cast iron frying pan that I like to use, so I always use a lot of oil. And I've got to get it ripping hot so that nothing sticks to it, right? So I often encounter this sort of convection current thing where you put the oil in and you let the oil sit there in a nice thick layer to heat up, and you'll see it start to kind of move around, and that's because of the way the heat is making the molecules move. But they make these really neat patterns, just kind of like blobbing around in your frying pan. That's an emergent process. Or something that's really cool. It's called synchronous oscillation. If you have a bunch of metronomes on a table, right? You know those metronomes that go click, 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 the actual analog ones, or clocks with pendulums, then you set them all up, the metronomes on a table, the clocks on a wall, whatever, and you start them going, and you have their pendula all swinging at a different rate. The oscillations from the moving pendula will spread out into the table or into the wall and cause all of them to eventually synchronize with one another. So that's like an emergent phenomenon. So maybe mental properties are complex emergent properties. They emerge out of processes that at the micro level appear to be determined and at the quantum level appear to be indeterminate. So we go from random and probabilistic at one level of analysis to determined at another level of analysis to free at another level of analysis. That's a possibility. So somebody who believes in that would say that we would call them an emergentist, somebody who believes that mental properties are emergent properties. And maybe that's one way of saying that we have freedom of the will. Or we can change the way we think about causation, right? Like Chisholm argued that free acts are the result of agent causation and not event causation. So event causation is like the billiard ball stuff. Cue stick strikes the cue ball that strikes the eight ball, etc. But agent causation is like, I'm deciding to try not to have coffee in the morning. I'm going to have orange juice instead, right? So maybe agent causation is something that we all have. We are all agents. Each of us has agent causation. And it's a different kind of thing than the causation we usually talk about. So if an agent acts and their actions are not caused by another event, then they are free in the important sense, free to have done otherwise. So if I cause an event, I'm causing it as an agent. And my actions, so long as they're not caused by other events, then I'm free. So this is a way of thinking about different kinds of causes. That's what's going on here. And Timothy O'Connor follows this line of thinking. He says that um, event causation is something like the power of an object to affect another object, and that is sort of like what gets described to us with the laws of nature, right? But agent causation is a bit like we were saying before. Agent causation is a sort of emergent causal power, and intelligent agents possess it, but physical objects don't. Now, this sounds a little mysterious. What is it that makes agent causation different from event causation? It's a mystery. This is the mystery objection. What the heck? Explain to me what the difference is. What's the magic difference between agent causation and event causation? You say that I, as an agent, have agent causation. Okay. It's an emergent property. Okay. Good luck explaining how it works if it's an emergent property, because emergent properties are pretty complex. So that's kind of like the gist of the mystery objection. But then finally we get to compatibilism. Hard determinists, aka incompatibilists, again see that free will is not compatible with a deterministic universe. You can have free will, but you can't have a deterministic universe. You can have a deterministic universe, and that means you don't have free will. But the alternative is compatibilism. Free will is compatible with a deterministic universe. Um, and there are thinkers that we've read who anticipate this view. Aristotle and Hume are a couple that are mentioned by Crumley. William James was a compatibilist. He called compatibilism soft determinism. And Jonathan Edwards here believes that our actions are caused, but we are still free, because what free will is the power, opportunity, or advantage that anyone has to do as he pleases. Or, in other words, his being free from hindrance or impediment in the way of doing or conducting in any respect as he wills. So, our will is caused, but it's caused by our beliefs, desires, motives, etc. This is what separates us from machines, right? Descartes thought that we were different from machines, and he included animals in that category, machines. Descartes thought that what separated us from them is that we had a soul, which is responsible for which is what makes it possible for us to think, perceive, make decisions. But Edward says no. We do have mental states, and that's the crucial thing. Our actions are caused, but they're caused by something internal to the mind. That's what separates us from machines. So, and what he says here, to do as you please, to be free from hindrance or impediment. Nowadays, we understand this in terms of being free from compulsion instead of the absence of some cause. So, sure, my actions are caused. Of course, they're caused. Like if I yawn, that's kind of involuntary, but maybe it's caused by, oh no, maybe it's caused by, I don't know, a lack of oxygen in the brain or something. I don't know why we yawn, all right? Or if I reach up to get my coffee, maybe that's caused by, maybe there was a readiness potential, like do 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 get the coffee, and I didn't exercise my free won't, so I took the coffee. But why didn't I exercise my free won't, my conscious veto? Because I wanted the coffee. So, there's causes. Sure, there's causes there. My actions are caused, but they're not compelled. I'm not being compelled or coerced to do anything. Right? Um, and notice that compatibilism really emphasizes agency, right? It emphasizes deliberating things rationally. I mean, my coffee example was not a good example of that, but in deciding what courses to take, for example, it's the winter, we're heading into the winter semester, and at some point, you all are going to have to choose your courses for your second year, if you're a first year student, which most of you are. And in deciding what, like maybe, oh, should I take more philosophy? Well, I'm going to have to think about that. Will it be interesting and fun and informative? And do I have a good chance of success if I buckle down and study? Yeah, probably. But maybe you're also just not that interested in philosophy and you want to study something else. Well, what do you want to study? You've got to think about it. So that's the rational deliberation. And then you have to act on the basis of reasons. You have to exercise your agency. And this is absent in cases of compulsion. So, a few examples that Crumley mentions are maybe like a kleptomaniac who steals something. Well, they're compelled to take those objects. Maybe somebody has an obsessive compulsive sort of disorder, and they can't help but perform specific behaviors in specific ways to alleviate, I don't know, anxiety. Um, they're sort of compelled to do that, right? It's not rational. That's why we consider it a mental illness and we try to help people who have it. Likewise with kleptomania. Or imagine if you're late for class. I mean, obviously, you don't have to worry about this today because you're online, but imagine you're late for class because you get a flat tire or the bus that you take breaks down or the bus is late. Well, I can't really hold you responsible. And this happens a lot. I often get people late for class. And if I know that they live on campus, I'll be a little more mad about it. Because it's like, come on, you just had to walk through the tunnels, right? I mean, those tunnels blew my mind when I got here. I did my master's degree at Carleton. Tunnels blew my mind so much. My first day in the department, I wore my slippers because I was able to simply walk through the tunnels. I didn't have to go outside. I thought that was quite cool. But if you have to take OC Transpo or a car, um, and something happens, yeah, I'm going to be a little less miffed if you're late. because I realize that certain things out of your control can happen to you. What if a mad scientist put a chip in my brain to cause me to behave a certain way? Yeah, the tunnels in the winter are good. They get awfully warm in the wintertime. They really put the heat on down there. A mad scientist could put a chip in my brain and she could push a button that makes me scream a word like pickles, something innocuous. Hopefully it's not a mad scientist that's making me say like a swear word every time in an inappropriate circumstance, but you get the idea. Every time the scientist pushes the button and I speak the word, I it's not me who's making that happen, right? Yeah, a reptile. Yeah, some people like the heat, some people don't like the heat, and that's fair. Um, Robbing a bank because some crime lord will kill your family if you don't. I think this came up in my other. Well, I don't remember. Maybe it was this one, maybe it was the other class, but I always bring up that scene in Breaking Bad in the first season where Walter White has Domingo in the basement and yeah. and uh and he has to decide whether to kill him or let him go. He makes a list. He tries to rationally deliberate, and he realizes that well, I've got to kill him, or he'll kill my whole family. So, so some of these are examples of internal compulsion, like the kleptomaniac, the person with OCD, and the others are examples of external compulsion. But either way, if you're a compatibilist, for your action to be free, they cannot be compelled, whether internally or externally. And free actions are the actions that an agent makes according to reasons. You you deliberate rationally and you act on the basis of those reasons. And if you do that, and if you're not coerced or compelled, then you're free in the sense that you could have done otherwise. Now, critics would say that, well, this kind of choice isn't really choosing at all. They would say, well, an agent's actions are caused by their beliefs and desires, and these are in turn determined by the laws of nature and prior conditions. And if this is true, there's no sense in which an agent could have done otherwise. But compatibilists respond by saying that we're still free to have done otherwise, since the agent would have done otherwise had she chosen to. And this is the ability analysis of the word can. As Schopenhauer famously put it, man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. I think Crumley gives a slightly different translation in the textbook, but I like this one. So, what does he mean? I can do what I want. I cannot will what I want. Like music. What do I want to listen to? I can do what I will. I can decide to listen to any genre of music that I like. Is it a heavy metal day? Is it a jazz day? Is it a blues day or a classic rock day or maybe a classical day? Well, I can decide, but I cannot will what I will. I cannot will that I should like, and I'm sorry, everyone, Taylor Swift. I cannot will that I should be a Swiftie. Or Wicked on repeat. I imagine a lot of people are doing that now, listening to that on repeat. I actually don't know very many of those songs. All week. Yeah, fair. Um, but it's true, right? Like there's a range of options that you have. Oh, it's a musical. It's a musical. It's like a sort of Wizard of Oz backstory. Yeah. And it was on Broadway, but they made a movie. and now the movie's out and everybody's enjoying it. I don't know though. I'm weird about musical films. I think musicals are meant to be enjoyed live, I guess, is what I'm saying. So, yeah, I want if I go see a musical, I want to see it live. But I don't know. That's just me. Yeah, I guess they can be done right. I mean, The Sound of Music, right? I mean, that's a musical film that I think everybody's got to see. It's classic. It's a classic. Come on, it's a classic. Um, so what was I saying? Right. Yeah, you can do what you will, but you can't will what you will. Or Frankfurt, who says maybe free will isn't about escaping determinism. It's about acting on the desires that you want to have. So we have first order desires and second order desires. First order desires might be something like, ooh, I'd really like to eat that piece of cheesecake in the fridge. Like, oh, I'm craving that cheesecake. But a second order desire is, I really should be eating less cheesecake. Maybe you're on a meal plan. Maybe you're trying to go to the gym, trying to beef up a little bit, maybe lose a couple pounds. And you can have some cheesecake on your cheat day, but it's not your cheat day. So your desire is to desire less cake. So that's a second order desire. So if you act on the second order desires like that, or indeed any desire that you want to have, then you're exercising your will. And that's why if you're a compatibilist, it doesn't really matter if your choices are determined. What matters is that they're determined by your will or your choices, right? So actions need to be voluntary and uncoerced or uncompelled. They don't have to not be determined. They just have to not be coerced or compelled, and they have to be voluntary. All right. It's actually about 1 minute to go, and I don't think, I mean, we'll just finish this real quick next time. This little bit on moral responsibility. And then, of course, we'll also talk about uh, the nature and existence of God. I will probably have to take some parts out of that lecture just so that we have time. Would it be safe to say free will is choice and the right to choose in the context and how you make your choices? Um, as type, I don't know what you mean by the type. Um,
My brain's exhausted. It's kind of escaping me, but like whether or not you're like a dualist or determinism and you know what I mean?
oh, well, I mean, as we've seen today, whether you think you have free will depends on what you think free will is, right? Oh, interesting question, Chloe. So I have to admit that I'm not super familiar with the Foundation story, but maybe. I mean, I don't know enough about it. Yeah. I mean, I've read very little. I've read like one short story from Isaac Asimov. I've read more. You know what? I used to read those Library of the Universe, Isaac Asimov's Library of the Universe books. They were science books. I read those, but I didn't really read a lot of his science fiction. Um, yeah, so I'm sorry that I'm not really able to answer that question. One thing that I need to mention is that we do still have one more quiz, but here's what I'm going to do. Because the last day of class Oh no, it's Friday. Yeah, the last day of class is Friday, so you're gonna have the whole week to do it. Uh, but I might since it's the end of the term, I might have fewer questions on the quiz for you. Make it a little bit easier at the end of the term. So, yeah, so maybe I'll cut down on the multiple choice true false questions. Maybe I'll have like maybe just a couple of written answer questions and there'll be some choice. And that is like don't get too happy because there is still the final exam, right? I mean, and there's going to be stuff on the final. Um so but just a little bit of a break, right? Anyway, stay tuned for that. Well, I better get going. The final isn't on a specific date. So the final will be open over the exam period and it'll be like the quiz. You can start it whenever you want, but once you start, there's a time limit. I'm also going to break it into two sections. So you can write the multiple choice true false section separately from the written answer questions. So you don't have to do it all in one like 3 hour go. You can do it in parts. Yeah. 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 So I'm trying to make it as painless as possible, essentially. Okay, I've got to go. I got to get up to the campus. Hopefully I don't have a flat tire or something. Well, I won't. The bus will. But you know how the buses are. OC Transpo. Terrible. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining in today and I will see you all next time. Bye for now.